Hello everyone, I'm Maxine Paul, and today I'll be presenting my research, Cancel Culture, How Are Acts of Cancellation on Social Media Performed as Activism. In this research, I explore how social media platforms function as a public stage, where acts of cancellation become performances of activism. Specifically, I'll focus on two cases, the 2021 Dr. Seuss estate controversy and Michael Reinhardt's study of right-wing parental activism to show how users publicly display their values, gain visibility, and shape public opinion through online cancellation. Before I discuss my findings, I want to briefly define a few key terms that I mention and refer to. First, cancel culture refers to the practice of mass calling out or withdrawing support from someone as a way of expressing disapproval and applying social pressure. Second, performative activism is activism that's done more for social gain. It is defined by Boston Medical Center as activism that is done to increase one's social capital rather than because of one's devotion to a cause. And third, the role of social media and why it is important in this research. Because these platforms bring huge audiences together, they kind of create a public stage where people can share opinions, react, and in many cases perform their own values in front of others. Additionally, I want to highlight a key idea from Abdallah et al., which really frames my research. They explained that cancel culture began as a way to hold individuals accountable for harmful actions, but over time it has shifted into something quite different, a public shaming practice aimed at anyone who deviates from social norms. This shift is important because it shows where performativity enters the picture. Cancellation becomes less about justice and more about publicly displaying moral alignment. Moving on to the knowledge gaps, so I found that few studies link cancellation directly to performance. In existing research, there's a lot of discussion about cancel culture, what it is, who participates, and why certain figures or media get targeted. We also see research on performative activism, especially on how people use online spaces to signal their values. But what's missing is a clear connection between the two. There isn't much work showing how exactly acts of cancellation on social media actually function as performances, how users use cancellation to gain visibility, express identity, or align themselves with certain moral positions. And this gap becomes even more significant when we consider the role of social media. Because these platforms don't just enable cancellation, they amplify it. They turn individual reactions into public performances with audience, shares, and metrics that reward visibility. My project steps into this gap by examining how cancellation becomes performative activism in the two cases that I mentioned. So this brings me to my research question. How are acts of cancellation on social media performed as activism? For this project, I used two main methods: rhetorical analysis and close reading. First, rhetorical analysis helped me examine how arguments about cancellation are constructed in scholarly work and online discourse. For example, I look at how Abdallah et al. Frame cancel culture as shifting from accountability to public shaming, and how they use evidence and tone to position cancellation as a performance. I also analyzed Reinhardt's article to understand how he argues that parental rights activists appropriate cancel culture tactics to promote anti-queer narratives. With rhetorical analysis, I'm focusing on strategies such as appeals to emotion, authority, community values, and moral positioning, all of which shape how audiences interpret an act of cancellation as activism. Second, close reading allows me to examine the specific texts involved in cancellation events themselves. For the Dr. Seuss case, I read and examined the illustrations and lines in the books that were labeled racist. I analyzed how these images and statements were described, circulated, and reframed on social media. For the online reaction, I conduct close reading. For online reaction, I conduct close readings of tweets and comment threads that perform outrage, moral alignment, or virtue signaling. I look at language choices, repetition, hashtags, and how users position themselves in relation to the issue. Together, these methods let me move between broad discourse and specific textual moments, helping me understand not just what people say about cancellation, but how those acts become performances of activism within the public space of social media. In my first set of findings, I look at how cancellation becomes a form of activism. In Reinhardt's example of right-wing parental groups, these parents use cancel culture to push an anti-queer agenda in schools, framing themselves as activists by publicly rejecting books, lessons, and media they see as threatening, essentially to protect their own children from a quote-unquote predatory form of queerness. They are using cancel culture as a performance of activism, displaying their values publicly to gain attention, display their values, gain visibility, and to generate support. Social media platforms are used as outlets in this case to amplify these cancellations by spreading messages quickly and reshaping school media, in this case for the betterment of their children's education. Building on the idea of cancellation as a form of activism, we see a similar dynamic with the controversy around Dr. Seuss Enterprises facing the threat of being cancelled for racist illustrations in 2021. Here, users across social media performed activism by publicly engaging in debates, sharing posts, making videos, and reacting to the news. Social media acted as a stage for these performances. The 3 images I've included show how the discussion spread across X or Twitter, Instagram, and even Facebook through threads, posts, and reactions. The controversy itself became content, with users shaping the narrative and amplifying their viewpoints. Just like with the parental groups, this example highlights how cancellation can become a public performance. The significance of this research revolves around the understanding of how social media changes the function of cancellation. We often talk about cancel culture as either good or bad, but we rarely examine how it becomes a kind of performance, something people do publicly to signal their values, gain attention, or align themselves with particular social groups. By looking at cases like the Dr. Seuss controversy and Reinhardt's article, this research shows that cancellation isn't just a reaction to content. It can also become a public display of identity. These performances have real consequences. They shape what books get published, what materials appear in schools, and how communities define what is or isn't acceptable. This research is also important because social media amplifies these performances. The design of platforms encourages people to compete for visibility and participate in moral storytelling. Understanding these pressures helps us see why online activism can sometimes become more about being seen, acting morally, than about addressing the issue itself. Overall, I believe that this work matters because it helps us. Overall, I believe that this work really matters because it helps us who live in the digital age recognize how digital performances influence cultural debates, educational policy, and the way we understand activism in a social media-driven world. Whether in the Dr. Seuss controversy or in anti-queer parental activism, these acts of cancellation shape what stories are told, what media is circulated, and how communities define what is acceptable. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll now move on to my reference slides where you can see the sources that informed this project.